the house was gone. The savings account, emptied. 31 years of marriage, dissolved in a courtroom on a Tuesday afternoon while rain tapped against the courthouse windows, and his lawyer shuffled papers without meeting his eyes. Russell Caine drove north out of Edmonton with everything he owned in the bed of a pickup truck. A duffel bag, a toolbox, a dog crate in which his 3-year-old German Shepherd Bowen sat with his chin resting on the wire door, watching the highway disappear behind them. That was it. That was all of it. He hadn't planned to go to the lake property. He hadn't thought about it at all, not consciously. But somewhere past Red Deer, when the sky turned the color of old pewter and the radio stopped picking up anything worth listening to, his hands just pointed the truck northwest, and he let them. His father's land, 40 acres near Lesser Slave Lake, where a cabin had been sitting untouched since the old man died 8 years ago. Russell had driven up for the funeral, shaken hands with people he didn't recognize, signed some papers, and driven back to his life in Edmonton without once walking the property. There had been a life waiting for him back then. A wife, a business, a future he'd believed in completely. He believed in very little now. The turnoff was harder to find than he remembered. The gravel road had been swallowed at the edges by spruce and poplar, the tree line pressing in from both sides like the forest was trying to forget the road had ever existed. Russell drove slowly, the truck rocking over ruts and frost heaves, Bowen standing now in the crate and watching out the windshield with his ears forward. The cabin appeared in the headlights just after 9 in the evening. Russell sat in the truck for a long moment with the engine running. It was smaller than he remembered, lower. The porch railing had collapsed on one side, and the roof over the woodshed had caved under years of snow. The windows were dark and filmed with grime, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly east, as though the forest had been pressing against it steadily for a decade and winning. He turned off the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. In the city, silence was something that happened between sounds. Out here, it was the other way around. He let Bowen out of the crate and stood by the truck, while the dog circled the clearing with his nose to the ground, reading 8 years of animal traffic in the frozen grass. Russell pulled his jacket tighter. It was early October and cold up here in a way that Edmonton hadn't been yet. The kind of cold that came off the water and settled into your bones before you realized it had started. The cabin door was locked. He didn't have a key, had never had a key, or if he had, it was somewhere in a box that Sandra had kept. He found a window latch on the south side that had rotted enough to give with a flathead screwdriver, and he climbed in over the sill, like a man breaking into the only thing he had left to his name. Inside smelled of mouse droppings and old wood, and something faintly mineral, like the earth beneath the floorboards, was making itself known. He found the breaker panel with his phone light and threw switches until a single bulb in the kitchen ceiling flickered on, casting everything in pale yellow. His father's coffee mug was still on the table. Russell stood there looking at it for a while. He was 63 years old. He had served 2 tours in the Gulf with the Canadian forces, come home in one piece, built a contracting business with his own hands, raised 2 daughters, and paid taxes for 40 years without complaint. He had done everything the way a man was supposed to do things. And he was standing in a dead man's kitchen at 9 o'clock at night with a shepherd dog and a duffel bag and nowhere else to go. He put the mug in the sink. He found an old wool blanket in the bedroom closet that smelled like his father's aftershave, and still did. Somehow, after all these years, he spread it on the floor near the wall and fell asleep with Bowen pressed against his back. In the morning, the lake was visible through the trees, flat and gray under an overcast sky. Russell stood on the porch with a cup of instant coffee. He'd found a jar in the back of a cabinet, old enough that it'd gone slightly stale, and watched the mist sit on the water. Bowen was already out in the tree line, working some trail that interested him, nose low and tail moving in slow arcs. He was a big dog, 90 pounds, with a dark saddle and a serious face that strangers sometimes found intimidating. Russell had bought him as a pup 3 years ago, When he'd first started sleeping badly, thinking a dog in the house might help, it had. More than he'd expected. The cabin was in worse shape than he'd let himself see in the dark. The woodshed roof needed replacing entirely. 3 windows had cracked from cold expansion and contracted back to something held only by habit. The well pump worked, but the pressure tank was waterlogged and would need a new bladder before winter. The outhouse, there was no indoor plumbing, a fact he'd managed not to fully reckon with until this morning, leaned at an angle that suggested it had ambitions of returning to the soil. He made a list on the back of a gas station receipt. Then he made another list of what he had in the truck. Tools, yes. The toolbox was well stocked, a contractor's habit. Some food he'd thrown in without much thinking. Canned beans, crackers, a block of cheese, 2 cans of coffee, a bag of oats, enough for a week if he was careful. Dog food for Bowen, a sleeping bag that would be adequate until real winter hit. He had $1,700 in a checking account that Sandra's lawyer hadn't known about because it was technically the business account for a numbered company he'd never dissolved. It wasn't marital property. His own lawyer had confirmed, though the look on the man's face had suggested that $1,700 was barely worth the paperwork. It was what he had. He spent the first 3 days doing triage, the things that would kill him if he left them, before the things that would merely make him miserable. He banked the foundation with dirt where the skirting had rotted out and cold air was getting under the floor. He tarped the woodshed roof and started splitting the deadfall he found at the edge of the property, a stand of spruce that had come down in some storm years ago and dried in place. Good firewood. His father had always said spruce burned fast and hot, not like birch, but it would do for the shoulder season. Bowen followed him through all of it. Not underfoot, the dog had a sense for that, for when to stay back, but present. Watching. When Russell stopped to rest, which he did more than he used to, Bowen would settle nearby and wait without complaint. At night, they sat by the wood stove, Russell with whatever he was reading from a small stack of paperbacks he'd found on the shelf. His father's tastes had run to history and the occasional Western, and Bowen with his head on Russell's foot. It was not a bad life, in certain specific ways. He noticed that, despite himself. His daughter called on a Thursday. Melissa was 41, lived in Calgary, worked in pharmaceutical sales. She had her mother's directness and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she had taken her mother's side in the divorce, with the completeness of someone who had chosen a team and refused to acknowledge the complexity of the game. "Dad, where are you?" "At the lake property. Grandpa's cabin." A pause. "Why?" "Because it's mine. We need to talk about the property, actually." Her voice had shifted to the careful tone he recognized, the one she used when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed. "Mom's lawyer says the land might be part of the estate if it was held jointly at any point, and it wasn't. It was left to me directly. I have the will." "There are questions about Melissa." He kept his voice level. He'd had a long time to practice that. "Your grandfather left me this land. It was never in my name jointly with your mother. It was never marital property. I've already spoken to a lawyer about this." He hadn't, not specifically about this, but he would. Another pause. Longer this time. "She's really struggling, Dad." Russell looked out the window at the spruce trees, at the gray October light coming through them. Bowen was lying by the door, watching him with amber eyes. "I know," he said, and he did know. He wasn't a man who enjoyed other people's suffering, even when they'd earned it. She lost the business too. She didn't lose the business. She got half of it in the settlement, and then she sold her half to Adrian Kowalski for $400,000. That's not losing something, Melissa. That's collecting. The silence on the line had a particular quality. "I have to go," he said. "There's a lot of work to do out here. Call me when you want to talk about something other than your mother's finances." He hung up. He stood there with the phone in his hand for a moment, then put it face down on the table. Bowen got up, crossed the room, and leaned against his leg. "Yeah," Russell said. "I know." It was Bowen who found it. This was in the second week of October. On a morning when the first real frost had come overnight and turned the grass white and crackling underfoot, Russell was checking the tree line on the north side of the property, looking for more deadfall he could cut, when Bowen veered off the path he'd been following and disappeared into a dense stand of poplar 30 meters from the cabin. Russell waited. The dog didn't come back. He called. Bowen barked. Once, twice. The sharp attention bark, not the alert bark, not the anxious one. The one that meant, come, look at this. He pushed through the poplars, branches catching at his jacket, until he came out into a small clearing he hadn't known was there. The trees had grown up around it, closing it in, but the ground was different here. Flatter, more intentional. A rectangle of earth slightly raised from the surrounding soil. Maybe 3 meters by 4, with a rusted iron ring set into a concrete pad at one end. Bowen was sitting next to the iron ring, looking at Russell with patient expectation, as though he'd been waiting for the human to catch up to what was already obvious. Russell crouched down and brushed years of leaf litter away from the concrete. The pad was solid, well poured, the kind of work that was meant to last. He gripped the ring and pulled. It didn't move. He found a length of steel pipe from his toolbox, threaded it through the ring for leverage, and pulled again. The hatch lifted with the groan of old hinges and a breath of cold air that smelled of earth and metal and something else. Something dry and slightly chemical, like the inside of a gun safe. Russell shone his flashlight down into the dark. Stairs. Concrete, 8 of them, leading down into a space maybe 2.5 meters deep. He climbed down carefully, testing each step. At the bottom, he swept the light around. His father had been a different kind of man than most people knew. The space was roughly 4 meters square. The walls were lined with steel shelving that held. Russell moved the light slowly, taking inventory. Sealed plastic bins, military surplus by the look of them. 2 50-gallon water barrels, older but sealed. A propane heater, never used. Canned goods enough to supply a family for 6 months. A metal cabinet, padlocked, that he didn't know the combination to yet. And in the corner, wrapped in oilskin, a wooden box about the size of a small suitcase. He brought the wooden box up first, inside the oilskin. Inside the box, he found his father's papers, not financial records. Those were somewhere in a lawyer's archive in Edmonton. These were the other papers. Letters, photographs, documents his father had kept separate from his official life. And underneath the letters, in a sealed envelope with Russell written on it in his father's handwriting. A document that his father's lawyer apparently had never seen. A second deed to 20 acres in the Peace Country, land adjacent to a natural gas easement that had been worth almost nothing when his father bought it 40 years ago, and which Russell, sitting on the floor of a bunker in the October cold with Bowen pressed against his side, had reason to believe might be worth considerably more now. He sat there for a long time. Outside, through the open hatch, the morning light was strengthening. A raven called from somewhere in the spruce. Bowen lifted his head, ears rotating toward the sound, then lowered it again onto Russell's knee. There was a note inside the envelope, in his father's cramped, careful hand. I should have told you about this years ago. I kept thinking there would be time. There is always more time, until suddenly there isn't. The land is yours, Russ. Do something better with it than I did with the time. Russell folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope. He called the lawyer the next morning. Not his divorce lawyer. That man he intended never to speak to again. But a real estate attorney in Peace River that a neighbor, an older man named George Tulloch, who ran a small cattle operation 2 properties over, had recommended over a fence line conversation the week before. The lawyer's name was Patricia Suin. She was efficient and precise, and within 2 days she had confirmed what Russell had suspected. The Peace Country land, 20 acres with an active royalty agreement tied to the gas easement that crossed it, had been generating income into an account his father had never touched, apparently waiting for a transfer that had never come. The royalty wasn't enormous, $1,100 a month, but it had been accumulating for 7 years. Russell did the math twice because he didn't trust the first result. Patricia Sewin did not seem surprised by any of this. She had clearly handled estates before. She had a list of next steps, delivered in a tone that suggested she had also delivered a list of next steps in roughly this order many times before. And Russell found her competence deeply calming. The padlocked cabinet in the bunker. Once he found the key in a tin can on his father's workbench that he hadn't thought to look in until the third week, held something less dramatic, but no less useful. Tools. Good ones. Surveying equipment, a transit level, a set of hand tools that were old enough to have been made well. His father had been a surveyor before he retired. Of course he had kept his equipment. Russell began to understand his father differently out here than he had been able to understand him from a distance. Sandra's lawyer sent a letter in November. It arrived via email to an account Russell rarely checked, forwarded by Patricia Sewin with a 2-line note. As expected. No legal basis. I'll respond. Don't worry about this. He didn't worry about it. He was occupied. He had re-roofed the woodshed. He had replaced the pressure tank. He had discovered that the cabin's foundation, despite its appearance, was actually in decent shape. His father had poured it himself in the late 60s, and the old man had done things properly. He had cut and stacked 4 cords of wood along the south wall of the cabin. He had fixed the porch railing, replaced 2 windows, and insulated the crawl space with materials he'd driven into High Prairie to buy. George Tulloch brought him moose meat in November and stayed for coffee and didn't ask many questions, which Russell appreciated. George had lived on his property for 50 years and had the particular quality of old-fashioned rural men who understand that some things don't need to be discussed to be understood. Melissa called again in late November. The conversation was different this time. "I talked to Mom," she said. "All right, she's not going to pursue the land claim. Her lawyer told her it wasn't worth it." "I know. My lawyer told me the same thing 3 weeks ago." A pause. "Dad, are you okay up there?" He looked out the window. The lake had frozen at the edges, a thin shelf of ice extending maybe 20 feet out. Bowen was in the yard, nose down in the new snow, following something. A rabbit trail, probably, though he'd learned by now not to chase them into the forest because he inevitably came back with burrs in his fur. "Yeah," he said. "I think I actually am. It's been 2 months. I know. You're not coming back to Edmonton." He thought about Edmonton. The apartment he'd rented for the last 6 months of the marriage, the bare walls, the parking garage, the sound of traffic. He thought about the way the city had felt like a place he was passing through, even after 40 years of living in it. "I don't think so," he said. "Not permanently." Melissa was quiet for a moment. "Can I come visit? I could bring the kids." He hadn't expected that. It moved through him strangely. "Yeah," he said. "Come in the spring. I'll have the place in better shape by then." Winter came in properly in December, and Russell found that he was not afraid of it. He had been, in a distant way, worried about the winters here, the isolation, the cold, the long dark. He was 63, and not in the shape he'd been at 40, and the cabin was remote enough that a real emergency would be a serious problem. He made contingency plans the way he'd made contingency plans in the forces, methodically and without drama, and then he stopped thinking about it. The wood stove kept the cabin warm. The bunker, which he'd cleaned and reorganized, supplemented his supplies well enough that he rarely needed to drive into town for anything critical. He had his father's books. He had his tools and a growing list of projects. He had radio signals he could pick up on clear nights, and a satellite internet connection he'd arranged through a provider in Slave Lake that was slow but functional. He had Bowen. The dog had adapted to the property, as though he'd been born to it. He ran the fence line every morning with focused intensity, cataloging whatever had moved through the night. He'd learned to stay back from the lake ice after falling through once in December. Not dangerously, only in a few inches at the frozen margin, but he'd been startled enough that he treated ice with respect after that. He slept on an old army cot that Russell had found in the woodshed and set up near the stove, and on the coldest nights he abandoned the cot entirely and pressed himself against Russell's legs, and Russell let him. There were nights when the weight of what had happened pressed down hard. Not the material losses. He had come to terms with those with a thoroughness that surprised him. But the 31 years. The particular grief of discovering that a life you had believed in was constructed, at least in part, from a story one person was telling, and the other had stopped believing long before the ending came. He would lie in the dark with that feeling and not try to push it away, and eventually it would thin enough that he could sleep. In the morning, Bowen would be there. That was not a small thing. Patricia Sewin called in January with news about the Peace Country land. A development company had been acquiring mineral rights in the area and had approached the easement holder about expanding the existing agreement. The royalty would increase substantially. Not retire to the south of France money, but enough that Russell's financial situation had changed category from survivable to genuinely stable. There would also be, Patricia explained, the option to sell the 20 acres outright at a figure that made Russell sit down on the porch step in the January cold without noticing the cold. "You don't have to decide anything immediately," she said. "Take your time." He didn't sell. He didn't decide that day or the next. But he stopped counting the money in his head in the way a man counts money when he's afraid of running out. And that shift had a quality to it that was hard to name but easy to recognize. He called George Tulloch and told him about it. George said that was good news, and that he'd always figured the old man had more sense than people gave him credit for, and that he'd bring more moose meat in February. Melissa came in April with her 2 children, a boy of 9 named Charlie and a girl of 6 named Wren, who spent the first afternoon chasing Bowen around the yard, with the focused intensity of children, discovering that large dogs are infinitely more interesting than anything else available. Bowen was patient with them. He was patient with most things. Melissa stood on the porch and looked at the lake, which was still showing some ice at the center, the edges gone open and glittering in the April light. She had her father's reserve and her mother's ability to read a room, and she was clearly reading this one carefully. "It's beautiful up here," she said. "It is. I didn't know." She paused. "I mean, I knew Grandpa had land up here, but I didn't picture it like this. Neither did I, really. Not until I got here." She was quiet for a moment. Charlie was throwing a stick for Bowen down at the edge of the cleared area, and Bowen was retrieving it with the exaggerated enthusiasm of a dog who knows exactly what's being asked of him and has decided to perform it beautifully. "Are you really okay, Dad?" He considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. He thought about the morning he'd arrived, the dead man's coffee mug, the mouse smell, and the darkness, and the weight of having nothing. He thought about the first time Bowen had led him to the edge of the property and stood there with his ears forward as though demonstrating the dimensions of the life available here. He thought about his father's handwriting on that envelope. "Do something better with it than I did with the time. I think this is the most honest I've lived in a long time," he said, "maybe ever." Melissa looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she nodded once, the way her grandfather used to nod when he was done arguing about something he'd accepted. "Okay," she said. Down in the yard, Charlie threw the stick too far, and it landed in the mud at the lake's edge, and Bowen went after it without hesitation. And Wren screamed with laughter when the dog came back shaking water across everyone within range. Russell stood on his father's porch and listened to his granddaughter laugh, and the sound of it went somewhere inside him that had been very quiet for a very long time and stayed there.